A home sat on the market for 4 months, seller dropped the price twice, still nothing. Everyone assumed it was overpriced. It wasn't. The real reason took me one showing to spot, and once I tell you what it is, you'll start noticing it in listings everywhere. This isn't about blaming anyone, it's about understanding something that trips up a lot of good, honest sellers. And here's something I want to say clearly before we go further, because this topic can get unfairly harsh online. A home not selling isn't a reflection of the seller as a person, and it's definitely not about any one generation doing something wrong. It's usually a handful of specific, fixable things that quietly stack up on top of each other until buyers start passing it by without even fully realizing why. By the way, thanks for stopping by. My name's Curtis. I'm a real estate agent with Lepage Team Realty right here in Ottawa. Each day I help buyers and sellers just like you navigate the largest financial transaction of their lives. My contact info is on the screen now, and it's also in the description below the video. Let's get back into it. So let's start with the one people assume first, price. It matters, of course it does, but I've seen homes priced fairly, sometimes even a little under market, that still sit for months. So if it's not always priced, then what is it? The pattern I see the most often is a home that was lived in and loved for a very long time, sometimes decades, without updates that keep pace with what buyers now expect as a standard. Not luxury, just standard. This is where I want to be gentle but honest. A lot of longtime homeowners did everything right for their own life in that home. They raised a family there, they maintained it, they cared for it deeply. But buyer expectations shift gradually over years, and a home that felt completely current 15 or 20 years ago, they start to feel dated to a buyer who's only ever known newer finishes without the seller having done anything wrong at all. Here's the specific thing that tripped up that 4-month listing. And it wasn't one big issue. It was 5 small ones stacked together, older light fixtures throughout, a kitchen that hadn't been touched since it was installed, worn carpet in 2 bedrooms, a slightly overgrown front yard, and furniture arranged on how the family actually lived rather than how it photographs for a buyer walking through. So none of those alone would sink a sale, but together they told buyers a story of a home that needed more work than it actually did. And that gap between perception and reality is the real problem more than any single item on that list. Buyers walk through quickly, often in 15 or 20 minutes, and they're making a gut impression the whole time. That gut impression says this needs a lot of work. Buyers mentally subtract a large renovation budget from their offer, even if the actual needed work is closer to a weekend project and a few $1,000s. So what actually fixed it once we figured out what was going on? Not a renovation, nothing close to it. Fresh, natural paint throughout, updated light fixtures, which cost very little compared to the impact they had, a deep clean of the carpets instead of full replacement, since they weren't actually as worn as they looked under the old lighting, a few hours of yard work, and furniture rearranged and a couple of rooms temporarily removed to make the spaces feel larger and more current. What happened? The home sold 3 weeks after these changes for more than the second discounted price the seller had already dropped to. And the lesson here isn't spend more, it's spend correctly. A relatively small targeted effort closed the exact gap that months of sitting on the market and 2 price drops hadn't been able to close on their own. I also want to mention something that applies beyond just older homes: buyer psychology around stalled listings. The longer a home sits, the more buyers assume something is fundamentally wrong with it, even when the truth is much more mundane. Outdated photos, a few cosmetic issues, or simply bad timing when it was first listed. And that assumption becomes its own obstacle, separate from whatever the original issue actually was. It gets harder to overcome the longer it goes unaddressed. If your home has been sitting, or you're worried it might once you list, here's what I'd actually walk through with you before assuming a big price cut is the answer. What does the home look like through completely fresh eyes? Not the eyes of someone who's lived there for 20 years and stopped noticing the details. Sometimes bringing a friend who hasn't seen the place in a while and asking them to be brutally honest reveals more than any market report ever could. And I also want to say this directly to anyone who's been putting off small updates because it feels overwhelming or expensive to even start. You don't need a renovation. You need an honest room-by-room walkthrough with someone who can see it the way a buyer will see it, and a clear, affordable list of the handful of things actually worth doing. That's usually a much shorter and less expensive list than people fear before they actually sit down and make it. And if this is your home, one you've lived in and loved for a long time, I want you to know that none of this is a judgment on how you lived in it. Homes are meant to be lived in, not staged for photographs every single day of your life. The gap between a lived-in home and a market-ready home is completely normal, and closing it doesn't take nearly as much as most people fear. I also want to address something that comes up in almost every conversation like this: the emotional side of hearing that your home needs any changes at all before it'll sell. It can feel like criticism, even when it's delivered gently, even when it's meant to help. I understand that completely, and I'd rather be honest with you than have you find out the hard way after months of silence and no showings. So let's talk about lighting specifically for a moment, because it's one of the most underrated factors in why a home feels dated, even when nothing structural has changed. Older fixtures, dim bulbs, heavy curtains blocking natural light, these things quietly make every other detail in a room look older than it actually is. So swapping bulbs for warmer, brighter options, opening up window coverings during showings costs almost nothing and changes the entire feeling of a space within seconds. I also want to mention smell, because agents talk about it constantly and sellers sometimes brush it off. Understandably, since you can't smell your own home the way a stranger walking in for the first time can. Pet odors, cooking smells, and even strong air fresheners layered on top of other smells, all of it registers with buyers before they consciously notice a single feature in a room. A simple, thorough clean and some fresh air before every showing does more than people expect. And here's a broader point I want to leave you with. A home that won't sell almost always just means a home that hasn't yet been shown honestly through a buyer's eyes instead of an owner's. Once the gap gets closed, even partially, the story usually changes fast, sometimes within just a couple of weeks, the way it did for that 4-month listing once we finally figured out what was actually going on. If you take nothing else from this, take this. Before you accept the big price cut as the only option, get one honest room by room walkthrough first. It costs you nothing but a little bit of time, and more often than people expect, the real fix turns out to be smaller, cheaper, and far less painful than the number everyone assumed was the only lever left to pull. If your home has been sitting or you're worried it might, I'll walk you through it with honesty, room by room, before you assume the big price cut is the only answer. Sometimes the fix is smaller and cheaper than you expect, and it's worth finding that out first.